The Order of Preachers, more commonly known after the 15th century as the Dominican Order or Dominicans, is a Roman Catholic religious order founded by the Spanish priest Saint Dominic de Guzman in France and approved by Pope Honorius III on the 22nd of December, 1216. Membership in the order includes friars, nuns, active sisters, and lay or secular Dominicans affiliated with the order, founded to preach the gospel and to combat heresy. The teaching activity of the order and its scholastic organization placed the preachers in the forefront of the intellectual life of the Middle Ages. The order is famed for its intellectual tradition, having produced many leading theologians and philosophers. The Dominican Order is headed by the Master of the Order, who is currently Bruno Cadere. Members of the Order generally carry the letters OP, standing for Ordinis Predicatorum, meaning of the Order of Preachers, after their names. In the year 2000, there were 5,171 Dominican friars in solemn vows, 917 student brothers, and 237 novices. By the year 2013 there were 6,058 Dominican friars, including 4,470 priests. A number of other names have been used to refer to both the order and its members. Their identification as Dominicans gave rise to the pun that they were the Dominicanes, or Hounds of the Lord. In England and other countries the Dominican friars are referred to as Black Friars because of the black capa or cloak they wear over their white habits. Dominicans were Black Friars, as opposed to White Friars or Grey Friars. They are also distinct from the Augustinian friars who wear a similar habit. In France, the Dominicans were known as Jacobins because their convent in Paris was attached to the Church of Saint Jacques, now disappeared. On the way to Saint Jacques du Haut-Pas, which belonged to the Italian order of San Giacomo dell'Alto Pascio Sanctus Jacobus in Latin, foundation. The Dominican order came into being in the Middle Ages at a time when religion began to be contemplated in a new way. Men of God were no longer expected to stay behind the walls of a cloister. Instead, they traveled among the people, taking as their examples the apostles of the primitive church. Out of this ideal emerged two orders of mendicant friars. One, the Friars Minor, was led by Francis of Assisi, the other, the Friars Preachers, by Dominic of Guzman. Like his contemporary Francis, Dominic saw the need for a new type of organization, and the quick growth of the Dominicans and Franciscans during their first century of existence confirms that the orders of mendicant friars met a need. Dominic sought to establish a new kind of order, one that would bring the dedication and systematic education of the older monastic orders like the Benedictines to bear on the religious problems of the burgeoning population of cities, but with more organizational flexibility than either monastic orders or the secular clergy. Dominic's new order was to be a preaching order, trained to preach in the vernacular languages. Rather than earning their living on vast farms as the monasteries had done, the new friars would survive by begging, selling themselves through persuasive preaching. Dominic inspired his followers with loyalty to learning and virtue, a deep recognition of the spiritual power of worldly deprivation and the religious state, and a highly developed governmental structure. At the same time, Dominic inspired the members of his order to develop a mixed spirituality. They were both active in preaching, and contemplative in study, prayer and meditation. The brethren of the Dominican order were urban and learned, as well as contemplative and mystical in their spirituality. While these traits had an impact on the women of the order, the nuns especially absorbed the latter characteristics and made those characteristics their own. In England, the Dominican nuns blended these elements with the defining characteristics of English Dominican spirituality and created a spirituality and collective personality that set them apart. The order's origins in battling heterodoxy influenced its later development and reputation. Many later Dominicans battled heresy as part of their apostolate. Indeed, many years after St. Dominic reacted to the catharsis. The first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, Thomas de Torquemada, would be drawn from the Dominican Order. Saint Dominic as an adolescent, he had a particular love of theology, and the scriptures became the foundation of his spirituality. During his studies in Palencia, Spain, he experienced a dreadful famine, prompting Dominic to sell all of his beloved books and other equipment to help his neighbors. After he completed his studies, Bishop Martin Bazan and Prior Diego de Chaves appointed Dominic to the cathedral chapter, and he became a regular canon under the rule of St. Augustine and the constitutions for the Cathedral Church of Osma. At the age of 24 or 25, he was ordained to the priesthood. The Albigensians in the spring of 1203, Dominic joined Prior Diego de Acebo on an embassy to Denmark for the monarchy of Spain, to arrange the marriage between the son of King Alfonso VIII of Castile and a niece of King Valdemar II of Denmark. At that time the south of France was the stronghold of the Cathar or Albigensian heresy, named after the Duke of Albi, a Cathar sympathizer and opponent to the subsequent Albigensian crusade. Dominic was fired by a reforming zeal after they encountered Albigensian Christians at Toulouse. The Albigensians, more commonly known as the Cathars, were a heretical Gnostic sect, holding that matter was evil and only spirit was good. This was a fundamental challenge to the notion of incarnation, central to Roman Catholic theology. Dominic saw the need for a response that would attempt to sway members of the Albigensian movement back to mainstream Christian thought. Prior Diego saw immediately one of the paramount reasons for the spread of the unorthodox movement. The representatives of the Holy Church acted and moved with an offensive amount of pomp and ceremony. On the other hand, the Cathars lived in a state of self-sacrifice that was widely appealing. For these reasons, Prior Diego suggested that the papal legates begin to live a reformed apostolic life. The legates agreed to change if they could find a strong leader. The prior took up the challenge, and he and Dominic dedicated themselves to the conversion of the Albigensians. Despite this particular mission, in winning the Albigensians over by persuasion, Dominic met limited success. For though in his 10 years of preaching a large number of converts were made, it has to be said that the results were not such as had been hoped for. Dominican convent established, Dominic became the spiritual father to several Albigensian women he had reconciled to the faith, and in 1206 he established him in a convent in Perugia. This convent would become the foundation of the Dominican nuns, thus making the Dominican nuns older than the Dominican friars. Prior Diego sanctioned the building of a monastery for girls whose parents had sent him to the care of the Albigensians because their families were too poor to fulfill their basic needs. The monastery was at Perugia, would later become Dominic's headquarters for his missionary effort there. After 2 years on the mission field, Prior Diego died while traveling back to Spain. When his preaching companions heard of his death, all save Dominic and a very small number of others returned to their homes. History. The history of the order may be divided into 3 periods: the Middle Ages, the modern period up to the French Revolution, the contemporary period. Middle Ages. Saint Dominic established a religious community in Toulouse in 1214, to be governed by the rule of Saint Augustine and statutes to govern the life of the friars, including the primitive constitution. The founding documents establish that the order was founded for 2 purposes: preaching and the salvation of souls. In July 1215, with the approbation of Bishop Foulques of Toulouse, Dominic ordered his followers into an institutional life. Its purpose was revolutionary in the pastoral ministry of the Catholic Church. These priests were organized and well-trained in religious studies. Dominic needed a framework, a rule, to organize these components. The rule of St. Augustine was an obvious choice for the Dominican order, according to Dominic's successor, Jordan of Saxony, because it lent itself to the salvation of souls through preaching. By this choice, however, the Dominican brothers designated themselves not monks, but canons regular. They could practice ministry and common life while existing in individual poverty. Dominic's education at Palencia gave him the knowledge he needed to overcome the Manichaeans. With charity, the other concept that most defines the work and spirituality of the order, study became the method most used by the Dominicans in working to defend the Church against the perils that hounded it, and also of enlarging its authority over larger areas of the known world. In Dominic's thinking, it was impossible for men to preach what they did not or could not understand. When the brethren left Proil, then, to begin their apostolic work, Dominic sent Matthew of Paris to establish a school near the University of Paris. This was the first of many Dominican schools established by the brethren, some near large universities throughout Europe. The order of preachers was approved in December 1216 and January 1217 by Pope Honorius III in the papal bulls Religiosum Vitam and Nos Attendantus. On January 21, 1217, Honorius issued the bull Gratiarum Omnium, recognizing St. Dominic's followers as an order dedicated to study, and universally authorized to preach, a power formerly reserved to local episcopal authorization. On August 15, 1217, Dominic dispatched 7 of his followers to the great university center of Paris to establish a priory focused on study and preaching. The convent of Saint Jacques would eventually become the order's first studium generale. Saint Dominic was to establish similar foundations at other university towns of the day, Bologna in 1218, Palencia and Montpellier in 1220, and Oxford just before his death in 1221. In 1219, Pope Honorius III invited Saint Dominic and his companions to take up residence at the ancient Roman Basilica of Santa Sabina, which they did by early 1220. Before that time the friars had only 8 temporary residents in Rome at the convent of San Sisto Vecchio, which Honorius III had given to Dominic circa 1218, intending it to become a convent for a reformation of nuns at Rome under Dominic's guidance. In May 1220, at Bologna, the order's first general chapter mandated that each new priory of the order maintain its own studium conventual, thus laying the foundation of the Dominican tradition of sponsoring widespread institutions of learning. The official foundation of the Dominican convent at Santa Sabina with its studium conventual occurred with the legal transfer of property from Honorius III to the Order of Preachers on June 5, 1222. This studium was transformed into the order's first studium provincial by St. Thomas Aquinas in 1265. Part of the curriculum of this studium was relocated in 1288 at the Studium of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which in the 16th century would be transformed into the College of St. Thomas. In the 20th century the college would be relocated to the convent of Saints Dominic and Sixtus and would be transformed into the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. Angelicum. The Dominican friars quickly spread, including to England, where they appeared in Oxford in 1221. In the 13th century the order reached all classes of Christian society, fought heresy, schism, and paganism by word and book, and by its missions to the north of Europe, to Africa, and Asia passed beyond the frontiers of Christendom. Its schools spread throughout the entire church. Its doctors wrote monumental works in all branches of knowledge, including the extremely important Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. Its members included popes, cardinals, bishops, legates, inquisitors, confessors of princes, ambassadors, and patriae. The order was appointed by Pope Gregory IX the duty to carry out the Inquisition. In his papal bull Ad Extirpanda of 1252, Pope Innocent IV authorized the Dominicans' use of torture under prescribed circumstances. The expansion of the order produced changes. A smaller emphasis on doctrinal activity favored the development here and there of the ascetic and contemplative life, and there sprang up, especially in Germany and Italy, the mystical movement with which the names of Meister Eckhart, Heinrich Suso, Johannes Tauler, and Saint Catherine of Siena are associated. This movement was the prelude to the reforms undertaken, at the end of the century, by Raymond of Capua, and continued in the following century. It assumed remarkable proportions in the congregations of Lombardy and the Netherlands, and in the reforms of Savonarola at Florence. At the same time, the order found itself face to face with the Renaissance. It struggled against pagan tendencies in Renaissance humanism, in Italy through Dominici and Savonarola, in Germany through the theologians of Cologne, but it also furnished humanism with such advanced writers as Francesco Colonna and Matteo Bandello. Many Dominicans took part in the artistic activity of the age, the most prominent being Fra Angelico and Fra Bartolomeo. Reformation to French Revolution. Bartolomé de las Casas, as a settler in the New World, was galvanized by witnessing the brutal torture and genocide of the Native Americans by the Spanish colonists. He became famous for his advocacy of the rights of Native Americans, whose cultures, especially in the Caribbean, he describes with care. Gaspar da Cruz, who worked all over the Portuguese colonial empire in Asia, was probably the first Christian missionary to preach in Cambodia. After a stint in Guangzhou, China, he eventually returned to Portugal and became the first European to publish a book on China in 1569–1570. The modern period consists of the 3 centuries between the religious revolution at the beginning of the 16th century and the French Revolution, and its consequences. The beginning of the 16th century confronted the order with the upheavals of revolution. The spread of Protestantism cost it 6 or 7 provinces and several hundreds of convents. But the discovery of the New World opened up a fresh field of activity. In the 18th century, there were numerous attempts at reform, accompanied by a reduction in the number of devotees. The French Revolution ruined the order in France, and crises that more or less rapidly followed considerably lessened or wholly destroyed numerous provinces. 19th century. To present the contemporary period of the history of the preachers begins with restorations in provinces, undertaken after revolutions destroyed the order in several countries of the Old and New World. This period begins more or less in the early 19th century. During this critical period, the number of preachers seems never to have sunk below 3,500. Statistics for 1876 show 3,748, but 500 of these had been expelled from their convents and were engaged in parochial work. Statistics for 1910 show a total of 4,472 nominally or actually engaged in proper activities of the order. In the year 2000, there were 5,171 Dominican friars in solemn vows, 917 student brothers, and 237 novices. By the year 2013 there were 6,058 Dominican friars, including 4,470 priests. In the revival movement, France held a foremost place, owing to the reputation and convincing power of the orator, Jean-Baptiste Henri Lacordaire. He took the habit of a friar preacher at Rome, and the province of France was canonically erected in 1850. From this province were detached the province of Lyon, called Occitania, that of Toulouse, and that of Canada. The French Restoration likewise furnished many laborers to other provinces, to assist in their organization and progress. From it came the Master General who remained longest at the head of the administration during the 19th century, Père Vincent Jandal. Here should be mentioned the province of St. Joseph in the United States. Founded in 1805 by Edward Fenwick, afterwards first Bishop of Cincinnati, Ohio, this province has developed slowly, but now ranks among the most flourishing and active provinces of the order. In 1910 it numbered 17 convents or secondary houses. In 1905, it established a large house of studies at Washington, D.C., called the Dominican House of Studies. There are now 4 Dominican provinces in the United States. The province of France has produced a large number of preachers. The conferences of Notre Dame de Paris were inaugurated by Père Lacordaire. The Dominicans of the province of France furnished Lacordaire, Jacques Montsebre, Joseph Olivier, Thomas Etorno. Since 1903, the pulpit of Notre Dame has been occupied by a succession of Dominicans. Père Henri Didon was a Dominican. The House of Studies of the Province of France publishes L'Année Dominicaine, La Revue des Sciences Philosophiques et Théologiques, and La Revue de la Jeunesse. French Dominicans founded and administer the École biblique et archéologique française de Jérusalem, founded in 1890 by Père Marie-Joseph Lagrange, O.P., one of the leading international centers for biblical research. It is at the École biblique that the famed Jerusalem Bible was prepared. Likewise, Yves Cardinal Conga, O.P., was a product of the French province of the Order of Preachers. Doctrinal development has had an important place in the restoration of the preachers. Several institutions, besides those already mentioned, played important parts. Such is the Biblical School at Jerusalem, open to the religious of the order and to secular clerics, which publishes the Revue biblique. The Faculty of Theology at the University of Fribourg, confided to the care of the Dominicans in 1890, is flourishing, and has about 250 students. The Pontificium Collegium Internationale Angelicum, the future Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelicum, established at Rome in 1908 by Master Hyacinthe Cormier, opened its doors to regulars and seculars for the study of the sacred sciences. In addition to the reviews above are the Revue Thomiste, founded by Père Thomas Coconnier, and the Anna Lector Ordinis Predicatorum. Among numerous writers of the order in this period are Cardinals Thomas Zigliara and Zephyrin González, 2 esteemed philosophers, Alberto Guillormati, historian of the Pontifical Navy, and Heinrich de Neifel, one of the most famous writers on medieval history.